Good morning, folks. Moondog here with Veteran Bikers MC, coming at you in 3D, so groovy, I dig me. All right. So what are we going to study this morning? Today I want to kind of teach you a little bit about the timeline history of civil rights here in the United States of America, stemming from the 1854 all the way up through the Obama administration, and including the Obama administration, I should say, a total of 168 years overall of civil rights legislation being introduced into either the House or Senate, and how Republicans were always in support of civil rights, and in every single instance, the Democrat Party opposed that legislation. Okay, so it's pretty lengthy, 21 pages worth of material here that I'm going to try to cover. It's going to take more than one video probably. You don't have to watch the whole thing, but you can skip through it. But just realize that anything that you skip over is just one more example that I'm going to list in this list of civil rights legislation being introduced, showing where the Democrat Party has always opposed civil rights, and that's just something else that you're just going to miss. But listen to as much of it as you can. Skip over some, like I say, but it goes all the way up through the Obama administration. Democrats have always been in opposition to civil rights. Let's get started again. 1854, the Republican Party is formed to stop the spread of slavery. The Democrat Party is decidedly pro-slavery. March 20th, 1854, opponents of Democrats' pro-slavery policies meet in Ripon, Wisconsin to establish the Republican Party. Stephen Douglas, Democrat Party leader, authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act around that same time. May 30th, 1854, Democrat President Franklin Pierce signs Democrats' Kansas-Nebraska Act, expanding slavery into the U.S. territories. Opponents unite to form the Republican Party. June 16th, 1854, newspaper editor Horace Greeley calls on opponents of slavery to unite in the Republican Party. July 6, 1854, First State Republican Party officially organized in Jackson, Michigan to oppose Democrats' pro-slavery policies. February 11, 1856, Republican Montgomery Blair argues before U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of his client, the slave Dred Scott, later served President Lincoln's cabinet. Again, President Lincoln was Republican. February 22nd, 1856, first national meeting of the Republican Party in Pittsburgh to coordinate opposition to Democrats' pro-slavery policies. March 27, 1856, first meeting of Republican National Committee in Washington, D.C. to oppose Democrats' pro-slavery policies. May 22, 1856, for denouncing Democrats' pro-slavery policy, Republican U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, he's a representative out of Maine, is beaten nearly to death on the floor of the Senate by U.S. Representative Preston Brooks, a Democrat out of South Carolina. It takes 3 years to recover. Wow. Okay. March 6, 1857, Republican Supreme Court Justice John McLean issues strenuous dissent from decision by 7 Democrats in infamous Dred Scott case that African Americans had no rights which any white man was bound to respect. June 26, 1857, former Congressman Abraham Lincoln, now a private citizen, declares Republican position that slavery is cruelly wrong, while Democrats cultivate and excite hatred for blacks. October 13, 1858, during Lincoln-Douglas debates, U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas, Democrat out of Illinois, states, "I do not regard the Negro as my equal, and positively deny that he is my brother, or any kin to me whatever." Douglas became Democrat Party's 1860 presidential nominee. October 25, 1858, U.S. Senator William Seward, Republican, a representative from New York, describes the Democrat Party as inextricably committed to the design of the slaveholders, as President Lincoln, Secretary of State, helped draft the Emancipation Proclamation. June 4, 1860, Republican U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, again representative for Maine, Republican out of Maine, delivers his classic address, The Barbarism of Slavery. 1861, Abraham Lincoln, Republican, is elected president. Most Democrat Party-controlled states secede from the Union in protest. April 7, 1862, President Lincoln concludes treaty with Britain for suppression of the slave trade. April 16, 1862, President Lincoln signs bill abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, D.C., Washington, D.C. Republican support, 83%. Democrat support, 17%. July 2, 1862, U.S. Representative Justin Morrill, Republican out of Vermont, wins passage of Land Grant Act establishing colleges open to African Americans, including such students as George Washington Carver. Continuing, July 17, 1862, for unanimous Democrat opposition, Republican Congress passes the Confiscation Act, stating that slaves of the Confederacy shall be forever free. August 19, 1862, Republican newspaper editor Horace Greeley writes Prayer of 20 Millions, calling on President Lincoln to declare emancipation. August 25, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln authorizes the enlistment of African American soldiers into the U.S. Army. September 22, 1862, Republican President Lincoln issues preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. January 1, 1863, Emancipation Proclamation implementing the Republicans' Confiscation Act of 1862 takes effect. The Democrat Party continues to support slavery. February 9, 1864, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton deliver over 100,000 signatures to U.S. Senate supporting Republicans' plans for constitutional amendment to ban slavery. June 15, 1864, Republican Congress votes equal pay for African American troops serving in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. June 28, 1864, Republican majority in Congress repeals Fugitive Slaves Act. October 29, 1864, African American abolitionist Sojourner Truth says of President Lincoln, I never was treated by anyone with more kindness and cordiality than were shown to me by that great and good man. January 31, 1865, 13th Amendment banning slavery passed by the U.S. House with unanimous Republican support and intense Democrat opposition. Republican Party support, 100%. Democrat Party support, 23%. March 3, 1865, Republican Congress establishes Freedmen's Bureaus to provide health care, education, and technical assistance to emancipated slaves. April 8, 1865, 13th Amendment banning slavery passed by the U.S. Senate. Republican support, 100%. Democrat support, 37%. June 19, 1865, on Juneteenth, U.S. troops land in Galveston, Texas to enforce ban on slavery that had been declared more than 2 years before by the Emancipation Proclamation. November 22, 1865, Republicans denounced Democrat legislature of Mississippi for enacting black codes which institutionalized racial discrimination. 1866, the Republican Party passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to protect the rights of newly freed slaves. December 6, 1865, Republican Party 13th Amendment banning slavery is ratified. 1865, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, launches as the terrorism arm of the Democrat Party. February 5, 1866, U.S. Republican Thaddeus Stevens, Republican out of Pennsylvania, introduces legislation successfully opposed by Democrat President Andrew Johnson to implement 40 acres and a mule relief by distributing land to former slaves. So again, the Democrats opposed that and won successfully. April 9th, 1866, Republican Congress overrides Democrat President Johnson's veto. Civil Rights Act of 1866, conferring rights of citizenship on African Americans, becomes law. April 19, 1866, thousands assemble in Washington, D.C. to celebrate Republican Party's abolition of slavery. May 10, 1866, U.S. House passes Republicans' 14th Amendment guaranteeing due process and equal protection of the law to all citizens. 100% of Democrats vote no. June 8, 1866, U.S. Senate passes Republicans' 14th Amendment guaranteeing due process and equal protection of the law to all citizens. 94% of Republicans vote yes, and 100% of Democrats vote no. July 16, 1866, Republican Congress overrides Democrat President Andrew Johnson's veto of Freedmen's Bureau Act, which protected former slaves from black codes denying their rights. July 28, 1866, Republican Congressman authorizes formation of the Buffalo Soldiers, 2 regiments of African American cavalrymen. July 30, 1866, Democrat-controlled city of New Orleans orders police to storm racially integrated Republican meeting. Raid kills 40 and wounds more than 150. January 8, 1867, Republicans override Democrat President Andrew Johnson's veto of law granting voting rights to African Americans in D.C. July 19, 1867, Republican Congress overrides Democrat President Andrew Johnson's veto of legislation protecting voting rights of African Americans. March 30, 1868, Republicans begin impeachment trial of Democrat President Andrew Johnson, who declared, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government of white men." May 20th, 1868, Republican National Convention marks debut of African American politicians on national stage. 2. Pinckney Pinchback and James Harris attend as delegates and serve as presidential electors. 1868, or July 9th of 1868, 14th Amendment passes and recognizes newly freed slaves as U.S. citizens. Republican Party support for that, 94%. Democrat Party support, 0%. September 3rd, 1868, 25 African Americans in Georgia legislature, all Republicans, expelled by Democrat majority, later reinstated by Republican Congress. September 12, 1868, civil rights activist Tunis Campbell and all other African Americans in Georgia Senate, every one a Republican, expelled by Democrat majority, would later be reinstated by Republican Congress. September 28, 1868, Democrats in, I can't pronounce this word, Opelousas, Louisiana, murder nearly 300 African Americans who tried to prevent an assault against a Republican newspaper editor. October 7, 1868, Republicans denounced the Democrat Party's national campaign theme, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." October 22, 1868, while campaigning for re-election, Republican U.S. Representative James Hines, Republican out of Arkansas, is assassinated by Democrat terrorists who organized as the Ku Klux Klan. November 3, 1868, Republican Ulysses Grant defeats the Democrat Horatio Seymour in presidential election. Seymour had denounced Emancipation Proclamation. December 10, 1869, Republican Governor John Campbell of Wyoming Territory signs the first in-nation law granting women right to vote and to hold public office. February 3, 1870, the U.S. House ratifies the 15th Amendment, granting voting rights to all Americans regardless of race. Republican support, 97%. Democrat support, 3%. And it just keeps going, folks. February 25th, 1870, Hiram Rhodes, Revels, becomes the first black seated in the U.S. Senate. That was in 1870, becoming the first black in Congress and the first black senator. May 19th, 1870, African-American John Langston, law professor and future Republican congressman from Virginia, delivers influential speech supporting President Ulysses Grant's civil rights policies. May 31st, 1870, President U.S. Grant signs Republicans Enforcement Act, providing stiff penalties for depriving any American civil rights. June 22nd, 1870, Republican Congress creates U.S. Senate Department of Justice, to safeguard the civil rights of African Americans against Democrats in the South. September 6, 1870, women vote in Wyoming in first election after women's suffrage signed into law by Republican Governor John Campbell. December 12, 1870, Republican Joseph Hayne Rainey becomes the first black duly elected by the people and the first black in the U.S. House of Representatives, 1870. First black in the House of Representatives. 1870 and 1871, along with Revels, Republican from Mississippi, and Rainey, Republican of South Carolina, other blacks were elected to Congress from Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Virginia, all Republicans. A black Democrat senator didn't show up on Capitol Hill until 1993. The first black congressman was not elected until 1935. February 28, 1871, Republican Congress passes an Enforcement Act providing federal protection for African American voters. March 22, 1871, Spartanburg Republican newspaper denounces the Ku Klux Klan campaign to eradicate the Republican Party in South Carolina. April 20th, 1871, Republican Congress enacts the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, outlawing Democrat Party affiliated terrorist groups which oppressed African Americans. And it continues. Can't separate the papers here to so many. October 10th, 1871, following warnings by Philadelphia Democrats against black voting, African American Republican civil rights activist Octavius Cato, murdered by Democrat Party operative, his military funeral was attended by thousands. October 18th, 1871, after violence against Republicans in South Carolina, President Ulysses Grant deploys U.S. troops to combat Democrat terrorists who formed the Ku Klux Klan. November 18, 1872, Susan B. Anthony arrested for voting after boasting to Elizabeth Cady Stanton that she voted for the Republican ticket straight. January 17, 1874, armed Democrats seized Texas state government, ending Republican efforts to racially integrate government. September 14, 1874, Democrat white supremacists seized Louisiana State House in attempt to overthrow racially integrated administration of Republican Governor William Kellogg, 27 killed. 1875, March 1st, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 passes. It is the first anti-discrimination law in America. March 1st, 1875, Civil Rights Act of 1875 guaranteeing access to public accommodations without regard to race, signed by Republican President U.S. Grant. Republican support, 92%. Democrat support, 0%. September 20th, 1876, former State Attorney General Robert Ingersoll, a Republican out of Illinois, tells veterans, "Every man that loved slavery better than liberty was a Democrat. I am a Republican because it is the only free party that ever existed." January 10th, 1878, U.S. Senator Aaron Sargent, Republican out of California, introduces Susan B. Anthony Amendment for women's suffrage. Democrat-controlled Senate defeated it 4 times before election of Republican House and Senate guaranteed its approval in 1919. Well, it takes Republicans to get anything decent passed. July 14th, 1884, Republicans criticized Democrat Party's nomination of racist U.S. Senator Thomas Hendricks, a Democrat in Indiana, for vice president. He had voted against the 13th Amendment banning slavery. August 30th, 1890, Republican President Benjamin Harrison signs legislation by U.S. Senator Justin Morrill, Republican out of Vermont, making African Americans eligible for land grant colleges in the South. June 7th, 1892, in a first for a major U.S. political party, two women, Teresa Jenkins and Cora Carleton, attend Republican National Convention in an official capacity as alternate delegates. Can't read too many words here. As alternate delegates. February 8th, 1894, Democrat Congress and Democrat President Grover Cleveland joined to repeal Republicans' Enforcement Act, which had enabled African Americans to vote. December 11th, 1895, African American Republican and former U.S. Representative Thomas Miller, Republican out of South Carolina, denounces new state constitution written to disenfranchise African Americans. May 18, 1896, Republican Justice John Marshall Harlan, dissenting from Supreme Court's notorious Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal decision, declares, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." December 31st, 1898, Republican Theodore Roosevelt becomes governor of New York. In 1900, he outlawed racial segregation in New York public schools. May 24th, 1900, Republicans vote no in referendum for constitutional convention in Virginia designed to create a new state constitution disenfranchising African Americans. January 15, 1901, Republican Booker T. Washington protests Alabama Democrat Party's refusal to permit voting by African Americans. October 16, 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt invites Booker T. Washington to dine at White House, sparking protests by Democrats across the country. May 29, 1902, Virginia Democrats implement new state constitution condemned by Republicans as illegal, reducing African American voter registration by 86%. Wow. Continuing. February 12th, 1909, on 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth, African American Republicans, women's suffragists Ida Wells and Mary Terrell co-found the NAACP. June 18, 1912, African American Robert Church, founder of Lincoln Leagues to register black voters in Tennessee, attends 1912 Republican National Convention as a delegate, eventually serves as delegate at 8 conventions. 1914, Democrat President Woodrow Wilson segregates the federal government and the U.S. military, reversing 50 years of previous integration. There you go, Democrats again. 1915, Democrat President Woodrow Wilson showcases the first movie ever shown in the White House, Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan epic. August 1st, 1916, Republican presidential candidate Charles Evans Hughes, former New York governor and U.S. Supreme Court Justice, endorses women's suffrage constitutional amendment. He would become Secretary of State and Chief Justice. May 21st, 1919, Republican House passes Constitution Amendment granting women the vote, with 85% of Republicans in favor, but only 54% of Democrats in Senate. Democrats. And then in the Senate, 80% of Republicans would vote yes, but almost half of Democrats voted no. April 18, 1920, Minnesota first in the nation anti-lynching law, promoted by African American Republican Nellie Francis, signed by Republican Governor Jacob Prius. August 18, 1920, Republican authored 19th Amendment giving women the vote becomes part of the Constitution. 26 of the 36 states to ratify had Republican-controlled legislatures. January 26, 1922, House passes bill that was authored by U.S. Representative Leonidas, I can't pronounce his first name, Dyer. He was a Republican out of Montana, making lynching a federal crime. Senate Democrats block it with a filibuster. 119 members voted against the bill. Of the 199, 103 were members of the Democrat Party. Okay. Let's see. I'm just going to take this apart. June 2nd, 1924, Republican President Calvin Coolidge signs bill passed by Republican Congress granting U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans. October 3rd, 1924, Republicans denounced three-time Democrat president nominee William Jennings Bryan for defending the Ku Klux Klan at 1924 Democrat National Convention. December 8, 1924, Democratic presidential candidate John W. Davis argues in favor of separate but equal. June 12, 1929, First Lady Lou Hoover invites wife of U.S. Representative Oscar D. Priest, Republican out of Illinois, an African American, to tea at the White House, sparking protests by Democrats across the nation. August 17, 1937, Republicans organized opposition to former Ku Klux Klansman and Democrat U.S. Senator Hugo Black, appointed by U.S. Supreme Court by FDR. His Klan background was hidden until after confirmation. June 24, 1940, Republican Party platform calls for integration of the armed forces for the balance of his terms in office. FDR refuses to order it. October 20th, 1942, 60 prominent African Americans issue Durham Manifesto calling on Southern Democrats to abolish their all-white primaries. April 3rd, 1944, U.S. Supreme Court strikes down Texas Democrat Party's whites-only primary election system. It's 1944, folks. August 8, 1945, Republicans condemn Harry Truman's surprise. Excuse me. Let me start over on that one. August 8, 1945, Republicans condemn Harry Truman's surprise use of the atomic bomb in Japan. The whining and criticism goes on for years. It begins 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing, when former Republican President Herbert Hoover writes to a friend that the use of the atomic bomb with its indiscriminate killing of women and children revolts my soul. February 18, 1946, appointed by Republican President Calvin Coolidge, federal judge Paul McCormick ends segregation of Mexican American children in California public schools. July 11th, 1952, Republican Party platform condemns duplicity and insincerity of Democrats in racial matters. September 30th, 1953, Earl Warren, California's three-term Republican governor and 1948 Republican vice presidential nominee, nominated to be Chief Justice, wrote landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education. December 8, 1953, Eisenhower administration Assistant Attorney General Lee Rankin argues for plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. May 17, 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren, three-term Republican governor of California and Republican vice presidential nominee in 1948, wins unanimous support of Supreme Court for school desegregation in Brown versus Board of Education. November 25th, 1955, Eisenhower administration bans racial segregation of interstate bus travel. March of 1956, just several months before I was born, 97 Democrats in Congress condemned Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education and pledged to continue segregation. Okay? I was born in September 1956, guys. June 5th, 1956, Republican federal judge Frank Johnson rules in favor of Rosa Parks in decision striking down blacks in the back of the bus law. October 19th, 1956, on campaign trail, Vice President Richard Nixon vows, American boys and girls shall sit side by side at any school, public or private, with no regard paid to the color of their skin. Segregation, discrimination, and prejudice have no place in America. That's Republican President Nixon. Later became President Nixon. November 6, 1956. 2 months after I was born. African-American civil rights leader Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy vote for Republican Dwight Eisenhower for president. 1957, September the 9th, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower passes the first civil rights law in 82 years, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Okay, now get this. The Democrat Party, they filibuster that bill. Strom Thurmond, 24 hours and 18 minutes, speaks on the House floor trying to filibuster the bill to keep it from passing. However, it was one of the top 5 longest filibusters in U.S. history. Democrat segregationists, the caucus, extended that filibuster 57 days effort from the 26th of March to 19 June before it was eventually passed. Republican Party support of the Civil Rights Act, 92% supported Republican, and Democrat support was 54%. September 24th, 1957, sparking criticism from Democrats such as Senator John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, President Dwight Eisenhower deploys the 82nd Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas, to force Democrat Governor Orville Faubus to integrate public schools. June 23, 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower meets with Martin Luther King and other African American leaders to discuss plans to advance civil rights. February 4, 1959, President Eisenhower informs Republican leaders of his plan to introduce 1960 Civil Rights Act despite staunch opposition from many Democrats. May 6, 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower signs Republican Civil Rights Act of 1960, overcoming a 125-hour, around-the-clock filibuster by 18 Senate Democrats. The Democrat Party filibuster the bill. Republican Party support, 93%. Democrat Party support, 68%. That's in 1960, folks. July 27, 1960, a Republican national governor, vice president, and eventual presidential nominee, Richard Nixon, insists on strong civil rights plank in the platform. May 2, 1963, Republicans condemned Democrat sheriff of Birmingham, Alabama, for arresting over 2,000 African American school children marching for their civil rights. June 1, 1963, Democrat Governor George Wallace announces defiance of court order issued by Republican federal judge Frank Johnson to integrate the University of Alabama. September 29, 1963, Governor George Wallace, Democrat out of Alabama, defies order by the U.S. District Judge Frank Johnson, appointed by President Dwight Eisenhower, to integrate Tuskegee High School. Moving into the Lyndon Johnson era, he was president after John F. Kennedy. Here's some background. Johnson had a long history. Now, Johnson's a Democrat. Keep that in mind. Same as Kennedy. Johnson had a long history of voting with the South against civil rights. And prior to 1957, he voted 100% with the South including voting against the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. After the Civil Rights Acts, the Southern Dixiecrats, who opposed civil rights, dissolved and most returned to the Democrat Party. Although if you listen to Democrat rhetoric, you would think all Dixiecrats became Republicans. Some did, but most did not. And to name a few that did not, Richard Russell, Mendel Rivers, William Fulbright, Robert Byrd, Fritz Hollings, and Al Gore Sr., the father of former Vice President Al Gore. Okay? William Fulbright was the left of the left, staunch apologist for Stalin, and mentor of the first black president, Bill Clinton. Okay, Fulbright was a Dixiecrat and a lifelong Democrat. The following is a portion of commentary from Paul Weyrich in Newsmax in 2004. Prior to 1936, those blacks who could vote generally supported Republican presidential candidates. The GOP was the party of Abraham Lincoln, after all. Even Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal failed to completely break the bond between blacks and the GOP. Ike received strong support from black voters in 1952 and 1956. Then came 1960 election of John F. Kennedy, no strong civil rights crusader before and even during most of his presidency, did make a special and emotional appeal to the black community by telephoning Coretta Scott King after her husband, the Reverend Martin Luther King, had been jailed. It worked, helping him to carry a majority of black votes. So they were hoodwinked. You know, Kennedy was never a supporter of civil rights. He was a Democrat. But the only thing he did is he took the time to call Martin Luther King when he was jailed in Alabama. And that went over well with blacks. And now they're assuming that he's on their side or he's for them. Senator John F. Kennedy had opportunities to vote on the Civil Rights Act of 1957, but instead voted to send it to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Instead, the vote happened and it passed with the help of Republicans. Even if the bill was not all it could have been, after becoming president, John F. K. introduced no new civil rights proposals. Okay? So after he was president, he didn't do anything for blacks. June 9, 1964, Republicans condemned 14-hour filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Act by Democrat Senator Strom Thurmond and U.S. Senator and former Ku Klux Klansman Robert Byrd, who was a Democrat out of West Virginia, my state, who served in the U.S. Senate until his death in mid-2010. Byrd, Klansman, former Klansman. June 10, 1964, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, Republican out of Illinois, criticizes Democrat filibuster against 1964 Civil Rights Act on Democrats to stop opposing racial equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was introduced and approved by a majority of Republicans in the Senate. The act was opposed by most Southern Democrat senators, several of whom were proud segregationists, one of them being Al Gore Sr. Democrat President Lyndon B. Johnson relied on Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader from Illinois, to get the act passed. 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes due to Republican Minority Leader Everett M. Dirksen's perseverance. The bill is filibustered again by the Democrat Party. Republican Party support, 80%. Democrat Party support, 63%. We're talking 1964, folks, not that long ago. 1964 to 1969, President Nixon doubled aid to black colleges, raised civil rights enforcement budget 800%, appointed more blacks to federal posts and high positions than any other president, including LBJ, instituted mandated quotes for blacks in unions and black scholars in colleges and universities, opened the Office of Minority Business Enterprise, raised purchases from black businesses from $9 million to $153 million, increased small business loans to black businesses 1,000%, increased U.S. deposits in minority-owned banks 4,000%, refused aid to segregated schools, and raised the share of desegregated schools from 10% to 70%. And the source was the WND. I'm not sure what that is. Okay, June 20th, 1964. The Chicago Defender, renowned African American newspaper, praises Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen, Republican out of Illinois, for leading passage of 1964 Civil Rights Act. March 7th, 1965. Police under the command of Democrat Governor George Wallace attack African Americans demonstrating for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. March 21st, 1965, Republican federal judge Frank Johnson authorizes Martin Luther King's protest march from Selma to Montgomery, overruling the Democrat Governor George Wallace. August the 4th, 1965, Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen, Republican out of Illinois, overcomes Democrats' attempt to block 1965 Voting Rights Act. 94% of Senate Republicans vote for landmark civil rights legislation, while 27% of Democrats oppose. Okay. August 6, 1965. Voting Rights Act of 1965 abolishing literacy tests and other measures devised by Democrats to prevent African Americans from voting, signed into law. Higher percentage of Republicans than Democrats vote in favor. July 8, 1970. In special messages to Congress, President Richard Nixon calls for reversal of policy of forced termination of Native American rights and benefits. September 17, 1971, former Ku Klux Klan member and Democrat U.S. Senator Hugo Black, Democrat out of Alabama, retires from U.S. Supreme Court. Appointed by FDR in 1937, he had defended Klansmen for racial murders. February 19, 1976, President Gerald Ford formally rescinds Franklin Roosevelt's notorious executive order authorizing internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. September 15, 1981, President Ronald Reagan establishes the White House Initiative to historically black colleges and universities to increase African American participation in federal education programs. June 29, 1982, President Ronald Reagan signs 25-year extension of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan, again Republican, signs Civil Rights Act of 1988. Compensating Japanese Americans for deprivation of civil rights and property during World War II, internment ordered by Franklin D. Roosevelt. November 21st, 1991, President George H.W. Bush signs Civil Rights Act of 1991 to strengthen federal civil rights legislation. August 20th, 1996, bill authored by U.S. Representative Susan Molinari, Republican of New York, to prohibit racial discrimination in adoptions. Part of Republicans' contract with America becomes law. Okay, April 26, 1999, legislation authorized by U.S. Senator Spencer Abram, he was a Republican out of Michigan, I think it is, awarding Congressional Gold Medal to civil rights pioneer Rosa Parks and is transmitted to President. January 25, 2001, U.S. Senate Republican Policy Committee declares school choice to be educational emancipation. March 19, 2003, Republican U.S. Representative of Hispanic and Portuguese descent formed Congressional Hispanic Conference. May 23, 2003, U.S. Senate Sam Brownback, Republican out of Kansas, introduces bill to establish National Museum of African American History and Culture. Okay. February 26, 2004, Hispanic Republican U.S. Representative Henry Bonilla, Republican out of Texas, condemns racist comments by U.S. Representative Corrine Brown, a Democrat out of Florida. She had called Assistant Secretary of State Roger Noriega, maybe, and several Hispanic congressmen, a bunch of white men. You all look alike to me. The following is from Stolen History Video. Since black leadership joined the Progressive Democrat Party and chose power over principle, black out-of-wedlock birth rate has grown to 70%, breaking apart the black family unit. Black male incarceration rate exceeds black male college enrollment. Black youth unemployment at 50% and black unemployment at 20%. And this is after black leadership joined the Progressive Democrat Party. More Americans today, including black Americans, are dependent on a new master, new slave master. That new master, the government, Democrat Party, due to progressive democratic policies. It is a dependence that for our former brethren, the slaves, fought against. History of civil rights support. Republican Party, 94%. This is overall. The Democrat Party, 35%. For 100 years, the Democrat Party did not want civil rights to pass. But they sure want to make you think they did. 3,500 to 4,000 abortions occur in America every day. 40% of those aborted are black babies. The Ku Klux Klan only killed 4,000 people in all. The abortion lobby kills 500,000 black babies each year, supported by the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party has never apologized for slavery or segregation, the destruction of the black family, and now they threaten to transform the entire nation. Barack Obama is the Democrat Party. Our country will never heal if our leaders continue to ignore the truth. That's why Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican and not brainwashed. Here is a list of current members of the Black Congressional Caucus, which includes one Republican, the Honorable Allen West, Republican out of Florida. He was admitted under protest. I believe he was out of Texas, isn't it? Maybe it's where he lives now. An ardent Republican, Tunis Campbell. He participated in the political revolution that Reconstruction launched. Following the passage of the 1867 Reconstruction Act, he actively registered blacks to vote and gave speeches on behalf of the Republicans. He was elected to delegate to the state's constitutional convention, served as a justice of the peace, and was elected to the Georgia State Senate. Racism in the debate. Okay, he just gets into a bunch of sources right now, and I'm not going to read through all the different sources, but as you can see, there's pages of all the sources. So this was well researched, guys. And so again, it's a timeline history of civil rights legislation passed in America, primarily by the Republican Party, and always, in every single instance, opposed by Democrats. So if you are in support of the Democrat Party, just know who you're supporting. Thank you.